Okay, so with this poem, I would say we are on very familiar territory. You can see that just by looking at the title, 醉史歌. Very pure and simple. Song when drunk, Stephen Owen translates. And really, sometimes the translations just give themselves. Song when drunk. You know, this is always something where I've always felt a great affinity for the predilections of many Chinese poets, namely their tendency to indulge themselves in a glass or two and then write poetry while drunk. Perhaps it's my own national affinity that predisposes me to appreciate this in them. As you may or may not be aware, I myself am from Sweden, and in the classical literature of my own sort of cultural region, the old Viking sagas and so on, I mean, drinking always also features quite a lot, even though what happened when they were drunk was usually they would poke their eyes out, or each other's eyes out, or they would burn down each other's houses and so forth. Usually in Chinese poetry, nothing of that sort happens. It's altogether more of the more melancholy and world-weary sort of drunkenness, though of course sometimes quite jolly as well. And in this one we have mostly of the bitter and world-weary type, but he also tries to be happy, you know, he tries to forget his troubles. So this is a song, gu, which is not really a poetic form per se. Actually, in a purely formal sense, this is a kind of weird poem, actually. If we just look at the rhyming, you know, what is this rhyming scheme, actually? I've never seen anything like it, though I don't always pay attention to rhyme that much. But here we have the first two lines rhyme, sheng leng, and then we have, this changes rhyme immediately. And what do these two rhyme? Rou and zu, I don't know. And then we have, oh well, song, yong, they rhyme. And here we got, I think, chi, si, mi, qi. I think all of these are rhymes in Tang Dynasty pronunciation. And I think this rhyme continues here. Ding, mi, shi. And here we have, then it starts rhyming alternate lines again, like luo, he, ge. And then every line rhymes for a while, lai, tai, zai, ai. And I don't think the last two lines rhyme at all, so I don't really know what's going on here. But this is it's very loose in a formal sense, and it's not exactly this is not exactly a poem that distinguishes itself for being of any particular high quality in any sense. But it is also, especially formally, it's hard to see that it has any specific qualities. The reason I choose it is actually not because of any of the formal interest or the poetic qualities, mostly because it's actually extremely simple. If you are reasonably competent in classical Chinese, it should be very easy for you to read and understand this poem. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the specific vocabulary here, only when I think it's motivated. And I'll just try to go through this fairly quickly, like 4 lines at once, but who knows. You know, I have a tendency to talk, as you may be aware if you watch this. And yeah, well, so let's first look at the sort of background to this. Song when drunk, there's a little preface attached to it, where it tells us that he's drinking now together again with the Mr. Zheng Guangwen, who is exactly the Mr. Zheng Guangwen who he accompanied on a visit to General He, in the long 10-poem series on the Shanlin, the mountain park of General He, which I did a very long video about fairly recently. So this is the same guy, and it's probably written like about the same time. Actually, this poem contains an interesting clue about the date of composition that makes it possible to fix it fairly precisely in time. It mentions buying grain from a state granary. Where is it? Here. 日敌太仓50米. 太仓 is the state granary. So this opening the state granaries and selling grain for low prices was a relief measure which was used when famine threatened, obviously. And we know that there was a bad rice crop in the Chang'an region in 753, and that's why the Taicang granary was opened. So this is written in the spring the following year. That is 754. We can be fairly sure about that. As I said, Zheng Guangwen, or Zheng Qian as we know him, there's a number of poems in Du Fu's catalog dedicated to him or about him or in relation to him. And at this point, anyway, they both lived in the suburbs of Chang'an. And they're drunk together. Yeah, so that's basically the backstory. So let's look at the text. 诸公滚滚登台省，广温先生官独冷，甲弟纷纷宴两肉，广温先生饭不足。I'm having a glass of wine myself here while I'm doing this because I thought it was appropriate, seeing as they are drinking, so I'll get more in the mood for this. 诸公滚滚登台省，台省 the censorate and ministries, Owen translates. We don't have to go into this that much, but this is basically the highest offices of the state. I think this is technically correct, actually, that the censorate is Tai, and there's the Yu Shi Tai, the censorate, and then there was the Sansheng, the three ministries. Anyway, this is like the top of the hierarchy. So there's many various gentlemen. Gun Gun, which is an adjective here for coming in a sequence without interruption. Everyone is taking up high positions, except for the poor Guang Wen Xiansheng. Actually, the irony here, of course, is that this Guang Wen Xiansheng, that is Zheng Qian, who is drinking with at this point, he's not actually just your run-of-the-mill sort of guy. He was a bona fide genius, and he was appreciated by the Emperor Xuanzong for his talent in the three arts of poetry, calligraphy, and painting. And there's this we know from his official biography in the Tangshu, that is the official history of this period. And it says there that the emperor personally created this Guangwen Guan, the Guangwen College, out of appreciation for this man's talent. But then it also says in the biography that he didn't have much work to do there, and that's why his Guan is called Leng. This translation here I think is a bit iffy. Sinecure, as far as I know, is usually like a positive thing. When you have a sinecure, you have a job and you don't have to do anything. Du Fu is here obviously complaining, so I don't know. Yeah, but that's nitpicking. Jia Di, the best mansions. Yes, Jia is the first in the series Jia Yi Bing Ding. So Jia is like first a range of housing, a range of mansions. Di being mansion then. So yes, the residences of the noble and fair, the noble and powerful. In these residences they are yan, sated, yes, with meat and fine rice. Owen says perhaps a bit literal, but this is almost a cliche, of course, to say that they're in the houses of the noble. They're like filled with, they're sated with all kinds of manner of fine food, but there are people starving, and it was a cliche even back then. And here I'm not even sure if we're supposed to believe that this Guang Wen Xiansheng, though his Guan may have been Leng, that he really didn't have enough to eat. Really? I mean, yeah, perhaps his salary is lower than you would expect, but than he would expect, perhaps. But have a hard time imagining that he would actually starve. Though on the other hand, we know that this was at a period when there was a shortage of grain. So perhaps there's something to it. 先生有道出西黄，先生有才过屈宋。得尊以待常坎坷，名垂万古之何用? This gentleman, so he repeats this also ad nauseum. 先生, 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 先生. This whole poem, actually, to me, it gives the impression of having been composed in haste. I like to imagine that, they perhaps had this sort of like a speed chess competition. Like, here I give you 1 minute, Du Fu, and you will compose a rhyme while I drink this glass of wine or something like that. And that's probably why it's not so polished, and it doesn't rhyme like a normal poem, and it just repeats itself all the time, and generally isn't of very, very high quality. But there's all kinds in this poem. Actually, there's all kinds of cliches. When I read it like word by word, because I wanted to do this video, I really was quite shocked at how many cliches and commonplaces Du Fu has fitted into this poem. I mean, it's not all bad, but it's certainly not all good either. So let's look at the 先生. Who is the 先生? Then Mr. Zheng, this gentleman. He possesses the way, going beyond Fuxi, yes, 出 here, surpass, and 西黄, yes, is Fuxi. Fuxi, of course, is a mythological emperor, actually in some accounts the creator of humanity in Chinese mythology. What is his Dao? That he would be more that he would surpass the creator of humanity in this way? Well, I don't know. He is not only does not only have the Dao, he also has the Cai, that is his talents. And here, of course, that is his literary talent and his artistic talent. And in these, he surpasses Qu Yuan and Song Yu. And Song Yu and Qu Yuan are, of course, the two most distinguished pre-imperial poets, let's say. I don't know actually if Song Yu was a pre-imperial poet, but Qu Yuan certainly was. And their poets feature in the Chu Ci, in this old ancient collection of poetry. And Qu Song, actually, they were obviously admired immensely by Du Fu, and this pairing occurs actually in several places in his poetry, which may be remarked, and maybe we'll run into it again. 德尊以待, virtue respected by a whole generation, referring, of course, to the gentleman, the 先生, but still, being like this, you can still often find yourself in a 坎坷 situation. 坎坷, actually, the most basic meaning of this word is to encounter an uneven path when traveling by wagon, and thus, metaphorically, as Owen says, aims always unfulfilled. It's very common, this word. 名垂万古之何用? It doesn't matter to have a good name, if we have to live like this. Again, a very common motif. All of this about Zheng Qian that he says now is quite formulaic and cliched. Then he goes on to talk about himself in no less pitying terms. He pities Zheng Qian, and now he pities himself. 杜陵野客人更痴，背鹤短窄宾如丝，日敌太仓勿生米，时父正老同金期. So himself, he is 杜陵野客. I should have changed this one. Actually, in my edition, it's 杜陵野老. which is actually quite funny because Ye Lao, like the old man from the country, like a country rustic, who is also old. Actually, himself, he's about 40 at this point. Chi is a somewhat unusual character. It means to laugh in a scoffing sense, sort of laugh through your nose, belittle someone. Geng, of course, here he compares himself to Zheng Qian. So, Zheng Qian, he's ignored, but it's even more, he himself is to be pitied even more. He's even worse off, and, perhaps implicitly that implies that, he's as gifted, Well, we know that's the case, obviously. So we don't have to speculate about that, but it's not, we can't be sure what Du Fu implies. But I always like to fantasize that these people, they know that they are, a person like Du Fu, that he actually knows that he is Du Fu, that he is Du Fu for the age. And sometimes he drops little hints in it. In his poetry. 被鹤 wears he. He is, homespun. It's some kind of quite coarse fabric, obviously worn by the poor. To take off was called to 解鹤, that is to loosen or take off the homespun cloth. And Du Fu, he has not had the privilege to do so at this point. Does he literally wear homespun? Or this kind of cloth? That's very hard to tell. And it's very hard to tell partly because everything in this poem is so formulaic. It's so formula-like. Anyway, his dress is not just coarse, made of coarse fabric, it's also short and narrow, because he's so poor. And his temple hair, the hair of his temples, is like silk. This is also supposed to mean that he's poor and disheveled, though it's not exactly easy to see why, but this is a commonplace. Again, it's just something that you say, 病如斯. And you're supposed to infer that the person is sort of down and out. 日底太仓五升米. This character I like. 底. It means to buy, but it's only used when you buy grain or rice. And there's another character which doesn't have the 入 here, but it has a 出 instead, the opposite. And that character is pronounced 跳 and is the opposite, to sell grain or rice. 日, obviously every day. So we can say that Du Fu has empty larders. He has to go to the official granary. Taicang every day. And as I said, this Taicang is the imperial granary in Chang'an. And it's because of the heavy rains of the previous seasons, if we believe the generations of commentators who have done research on this. This grain from the imperial granary was sold cheap to satisfy common demand, and it may also have been of quite low quality because it was old. 五升米. I don't know actually how much a sheng is. I think it may have been around a pint or around a liter, something like that. This 五升米, 5 pints of rice, it may also have been proverbial. That is another cliche, according to my commentary at least. Otherwise, Du Fu simply has quite a number of people to feed, because if it was just himself and his close family, he would get by pretty fine, I think, on 5 pints of rice, raw rice, every day. Often, 时, or time and again, he goes to Zheng Lao. Old Zheng, that is a honorific, of course, Zheng Lao, to call him old, but he calls himself old here as well in my edition, and so this character should not always be taken very literally. But actually, Zheng Qian, we know his date of birth, and he is more than 20 years older than Du Fu. So at this point, he was actually pretty old, or at least above 60. This is a word that I didn't know before I looked it up to make this video. 金期. 金期. It means one's aspirations, one's ambitions, one's mental life, basically. Jin is, of course, very common as a metaphor for one's inner heart. Jing is the lapel or the front of one's dress, and the thing that you have inside the front of your dress, of course, is your heart. And qi, in this compound, qi has the meaning of qi wang, that is to hope or aspire for something. Because I didn't know that this was a word when I read this at first, I thought that this construction was that this qi went together with fu. That he very often went to Zheng Lao, like the old Mr. Zheng, on a date, basically, after having agreed on a time and period, because this is the time and period where two persons with the same heart can meet, something like that. But it seems that this is actually a word, and I think this makes the syntax much more polished than than how I misunderstood it at first, because fu should really be used with a place and not with the time as object. Then suddenly, for some reason, he varies the line length. So we had 7 characters, a line up until now, and suddenly there's 5. 得千几相觅，沽酒无复疑。忘形到耳乳，痛饮真无诗。得千几相觅. Yes, we don't have to go into that. 沽, funny word that also means buy, like this di, which means buy rice. This one means to buy or sell alcohol. 不复疑. I don't know, does he normally hesitate? Yi? Yi actually generally means to suspect, but it also, in its meaning, it draws a little bit towards hesitate, so it works here as well. 忘形到耳乳, they turn into one person. Basically, they forget their respective roles, because remember the age difference, there's like 20 years between them. They wouldn't normally address each other with you, that is ar or ru, which are both informal second-person pronouns. But since they know each other so well, and they like each other so well, and they respect each other so much, they just throw away the titles and they drink. 痛饮真无诗. I don't know, the translation here is a bit much, like drinking oneself silly. 痛饮 is like drinking heartily, like drinking with great gusto and vigor and joy. The comments here, actually, they remind us of a wonderful definition of a so-called famous scholar, Ming Shi. I'd read this definition somewhere before, but I was delighted to be reminded of it. It says that a Ming Shi is not someone, this is a joke, of course, Ming Shi, a famous scholar, is not someone who has any special talents. It's just one who has many hours of leisure, who drinks with a passion, 痛饮, and knows the Li Sao by Qu Yuan by heart. So, yeah. 痛饮, like in that sense, in this way, Zheng Qian is my teacher, is Du Fu's master. Actually, I mean, if we just look at this line by itself, it sounds like drinking heartily like this, 痛饮, is my master or our master. Why is we call each other you and brother, and you can't really tell what's the difference between us because we're so close and we're so damn drunk and everything. And drinking by itself is our master. He's the only one we are subordinate to. I think that sounds just about as sense-making as the way like Stephen Owen tries to understand it here. Anyway, poetry is not an exact art. Let's go on. Up until now, as you may have noticed, I haven't been very impressed with the quality of this poem, but I think it gets better at the end. So now there's the Du Fuyen vigor and sort of a bit of his language splendor and the punch that his verses usually pack returns finally. And here we have something I think that is worthy of him, especially this first couplet here is very nice. 青叶沉沉动春灼，灯前细雨烟花落。但觉高歌有鬼神，焉知饿死田沟壑。As Cool Night engulfs us, this is a bit vague. This translation is a bit unspecific. 沉沉 is the adjective, deep more or less, and it belongs to the night. So the night is clear and it's also deep, and in it we get the stuff moving. We move the spring brew, like the ale or whatever, like whatever they're drinking. The spring brew. And it's raining a bit, and 烟花落. Flowers fall past the eaves. Yes, 烟花 sounds quite unspecific. It probably just refers to the flowers in front of the eaves. But I mean, one thought that I had was that it may be also that the rain looks like flowers falling from the eaves, but maybe we shouldn't overinterpret here. 但觉高歌有鬼神 loud singing, yes, singing out loud. 有鬼神, actually this is interesting because I read something about the same time when I looked at this about Roman religion, where in Roman nature worship, basically, it was believed that every place had a spirit, like a patron spirit, watching over it, and that was called the genius. And the pagans of Rome, so when they came upon a place that had uncommon natural beauty, for example, that they were very impressed by, they would like set up an altar there, and they would make an offering to the genius of the place. And this having a genius like that that's actually where our term genius comes from, like a genius of a person. It was said to begin with that a person has a genius, as if he has, a spirit around him that makes him do these fantastic things that other people can't. And this is really quite the same, In our loud singing, that is, their drunken poetry, it's as if there is a spirit or ghost and spirit in it, some divinity, Owen translates. But I think that at heart it's really just the same idea. And it's also an idea that is voiced frequently in Du Fu criticism throughout the ages. The idea that the poets had a genius is not a specifically Western idea, because it occurs over and over again that Du Fu has this quality, as if a higher being is writing through him, and that's why his poetry is so great. So that's quite interesting, actually. 有鬼神, it's like, basically you could translate it without too much, inconvenience. You could translate it as having genius. 焉知焉 is a question word. 饿死田沟壑, this sounds very drastic, like dying of hunger and filling some ditch. This is in fact a commonplace as well. Like 田沟壑 is like dying in poverty and anonymity. So this is with the force of repetition. It doesn't sound too drastic, actually, in the original Chinese anyway. Anyway, now that they're drunk, they don't care if they die and fall in a ditch and so on. We go on. It goes on in a quite nice vein, actually. It's not now Du Fu, I think he is really back on track here. 相如异彩亲底气，紫云识字中头阁。先生早复归去来，十天茅屋荒苍台。相如 and 紫云, 相如 and 紫云 refer to two poets of the Fu category of poems. Both are from the Han Dynasty. This is Sima Xiangru and this is Yang Xiong, also known as Yang Ziyun. Ziyun is his courtesy name. This Xiangru Qin Di Qi, wash dishes with his own hands. This refers to a famous episode in his biography. You know, Sima Xiangru was a really romantic sort of character, really our archetypal poet person. And, you know, at one point in his biography, he ran off together with the daughter of a wealthy businessman, as they all do. And they're said to have run a tavern somewhere until reconciled with the girl's father. And in the meantime, Sima Xiangru had to wash the dishes in his tavern himself, you know. So that's it. Yeah, sometimes poets, people of uncommon talent, end up in these fairly unflattering situations. That's the point, obviously. Ziyun, what happened to poor Yang Xiong? Well, he was even worse off. This Tou Ge jumped from a tower. This refers to an incident during the politically unstable years of the Wang Mang interregnum, which Yang Xiong didn't survive, unfortunately. He happened to know the wrong people, and he was to be arrested. And instead of being arrested, he didn't want to be arrested, so he jumped from a tower to escape, and he almost died in the process. So that's what that refers to. You know, basically, everyone who was a genius has a shit life. This one I don't know about though. 识字. I just thought this was such a extremely pedestrian formulation coming from Du Fu's pen, and I'm still a bit iffed about it. But apparently there was this formulation in his official biography that he knew a lot of strange characters. So that's what it means. But 识字, I mean, 识字 in modern Chinese is just to be literate, you know, to actually know characters. So perhaps I'm thinking too much of the modern definition here. Then back to the 先生, which is this gentleman, which is 挣钱, his drinking buddy. 先生早复归去来. 归去来 is the title of a famous poem, perhaps the most famous poem of Chinese poetry among these literati types, at least, by the famous lazy dog Tao Yuanming or Tao Qian, which was about Tao Yuanming's enormously correct decision to leave officialdom and go back to the countryside, you know, which is a cliche among cliches. Like, let's leave the offices, let's go back to the countryside. And, you know, Du Fu here has written at least a dozen poems already in his catalogue about this. So we know they're torn. They want to be famous, but they don't want to endure the drudgery and abase themselves. So there's a part of them that just wants to go back to the countryside, and the countryside is calling for stony fields and thatched roofs. They're going to dust, you know. They're go to waste, you know. Why not go back? They're huang, overgrown with green moss. So I think this is actually, if you look at the translation here, it seems like he's just stating you have written a poet about this. I think this is an injunction, you know. You've already written your poem. Well, this stuff is going to waste, like your fields and your house is going to waste back home. So now, better get going. Go back home. This is an injunction to his friend. The last four lines. 如树与我何有哉？孔丘道直俱尘埃。不须闻此一惨怆。生前相遇且嫌悲. Again, as I mentioned, the rhymes are iffy here. Of course, everything I say about Chinese rhymes at this point, like Middle Chinese rhymes, should be taken with a grain of salt, as they say, because I've not studied Middle Chinese phonetics, and perhaps these do rhyme, but I don't think they do. Anyway, 儒术 skills of a Confucian scholar. This is too little. This is really too specific. Ru has a much more general meaning. It's like just the educated scholar, whose job, and Ru Shu, like it's his job, whose job it is to like help a ruler to formulate policy and so on. This is the name of a social role more than a theoretical persuasion like Confucianism or legalism or whatever it might be. Like Ru Shu refers to that. Anyway, these arts of a politician scholar, they mean nothing to me. 何有在? What is it to me, all of this? It's nothing. Because 孔丘 and Dao Zhi, they're all both in the dust. 孔丘, his given name, the given name of Confucius is Qiu, and Dao Zhi, he represents like two poles on the moral scale, the worthiest and the least worthy. Dao Zhi, robber Zhi, is supposed to have been a robber in the spring-autumn period. This pairing is also somewhat of a commonplace. They have been contrasted before in the Zhuangzi, I think so. So this is not Du Fu's invention. He's just picking these things, but fairly ready-made from the pages of some old book that he has in his head. But, you shouldn't listen to this and think, have such gloomy thoughts. 不虚文辞易残创. I think there's a sense, there's a break in sense units between this. You don't have to listen to this and then you have your thoughts grow despondent. 残创. Sounds horrible with the 残创. It's not just gloomy, it sounds like much more than gloomy, like suicidal almost. Because now we're still alive and we have each other, so empty that glass. Hold the cup, actually it says. 谦卑, hold the cup. Even this conclusion is just the commonest of commonplaces. Now that we are alive, now that we're in this moment, lift your glass and say, "Bang!" So, I think this was perhaps a speed chess the poetic equivalent of a speed chess performance, something like that. He's just rattling off a poem as fast as he can and throws in as many commonplaces as possible. It would be quite funny, actually, if that was what they were doing, and then it ended up in Du Fu's catalog anyway, and everyone just worships every word that Du Fu has written, so they don't criticize it hard enough, which I think they should, because really from this until here, I don't think this is really worthy of Du Fu's level at all. Then it comes on quite strong here, and it becomes a little bit better. But okay. Anyway, I think you have noticed, if you know your Chinese, or if you want to learn better Chinese, that this is quite straightforward language-wise, all of it. So that's why I think it's a quite an acceptable and not just acceptable, what is the word? Appropriate poem for sort of beginners to intermediate students of classical Chinese. And that's why I thought I would talk about it a bit. And now I've probably already talked for half an hour already. I'm trying to make these videos not so long. But, on the other hand, we shouldn't sacrifice thoroughness for brevity just because of brevity. So anyway, this is all I have for today, and thank you for listening. Bye.